Hi, thanks for joining us on this series where we're looking through the Gospel of John. If you want to do the usual thing of sharing and subscribing, then please go right ahead. And if by the end you found this beneficial, then please click the like button also. Imagine there's a relative that you have been blissfully unaware of. Let's call her Great Aunt Sophie. When she was young, Sophie moved away to a distant country and she has been living out her days there, even gaining some celebrity and notoriety, turning the old rumour mill of the national papers. And one day you happen upon a news article about Sophie and it dawns on you that you're related and you want to know more about her, but at the moment, all you have to hand is this newspaper article, and it's not all that kind. So, keen to find out more, you arrange to fly over to meet Sophie in the nursing home where she now lives. Who better to speak to than the person themselves to find out more about them? So it is, the day comes, you set out from the airport and jet-lagged, you arrive. But you're met on the threshold of the care home with some sad news. The great aunt that you hardly know has passed away just a few hours earlier. So who was Great Aunt Sophie? You speak with the carers, her friends, her family. You show them the newspaper article, this public view of your great aunt, and you ask them, does this fit? Does this match up with what you knew about her? And over time, you build up a good picture of who your great Aunt Sophie was and in what ways she mattered to those who knew her. So, who was Great Aunt Sophie? Well, in essence, we're going through the same question and answer process in this video series, but with someone real and living. Who is Jesus of Galilee? If you want to know what someone is really like, then see what their friends and their relatives say about them. And that's the key point I really want to bring home in this video. So let's check in with those that spent time with Jesus, listened to him and spoke with him. And also we should see what the individual under scrutiny has to say for themselves. So how do we find out about Jesus? We look into the Bible to see what he said and what his friends wrote about him. These are the details that those friends considered important enough to write down for people like you and I to learn. So, good Bible study shouldn't solely be limited to one book or letter, as we could get tunnel vision on a particular topic. It's good to first take a wider view from different parts of the Bible. And then when we do focus on one area, then we can have more confidence that we're on the right track with what we discover. So when we cast our net wide, here we find some verses outside of John's Gospel that tell us about Jesus. It's certainly not a complete list. Pause the video if you want to note them down for studying later. So we've got God declaring Jesus is his son. Peter, one of his disciples, said to face of Jesus, he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus asked, "Why do you call me good? Only God is good." And also Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. And before his death, Jesus prayed, he said, "Not my will, but yours be done." And Jesus is described as a man who is a mediator between God and man. So now I understand that you've come here for John chapter 6. Therefore, we'll make an extra video that goes into these references that fall outside John's Gospel. And for me, they actually make the subject really clear. But if they make it so clear, then why is this statement, Jesus is not God? Well, why is it so hotly debated? Well, it's because it's easy to get caught up on certain words and phrases that in the translated English can be interpreted in so many different ways. So in the extra video, we'll also delve into some of the pitfalls of language. We'll put a link to that somewhere on screen or in the video description. Okay, let's continue. So here I've put up on the screen there. In John's Gospel, Jesus says a lot of things about himself that are symbolic. They are pictures, like similes and metaphors. So these could be interpreted in different ways. And we find that many people listening to Jesus at the time would often get the wrong idea because they thought he was speaking in a much more literal sense. That's especially the case here in John chapter 6. Now, to get a good understanding of what Jesus was saying, we need to consider different strands of evidence, and we'll go through those in a moment. First, though, let's bring to mind why this book was written and the context of John chapter 6, as that will aid our understanding as we go through the chapter. So, those that spent time with Jesus, like John, had a really good reason to record these things for us. It's because those friends, those disciples of Jesus, they'd seen him crucified, and they'd found that he'd come back to life and that he'd ascended to heaven with a promise that he would return. So they were really inspired. They're inspired to tell others about Jesus. And near the end of his account, John makes it really clear why he's written this book and why he's selected the parts that he included. It's there in chapter 20. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So there we go. That's why John wrote his gospel account. Now let's get some context to this chapter, because this helps fill in the background. It shows us what people's minds would have been occupied with at the time. So John chapter 6, it begins by the Sea of Galilee, and it's roughly 2.5 years into the ministry of Jesus. And that means that there was a little over a year to go until his crucifixion outside Jerusalem. Now, verse 4, it tells us that the Feast of Passover was due to happen very soon. So people were likely thinking about food and thinking about a time of celebration and of spending time together. And I think that's a relevant detail because in John chapter 6, we find food aplenty, especially at the start. Here's the chapter broken into sections. We've got those first 15 verses where we find Jesus feeds the 5,000. That famous miracle that Jesus performed to feed the crowds. The people didn't know at the time, though, when they were eating their bread and so on, and the fish, they didn't know that they were being prepared for another lesson that would come the following day. Well, later on that day, on that first day, Jesus walks across the water of the Sea of Galilee to the boat that his disciples are in. And then the next day, the crowds come back. They come back and they find him again in a different place. They find him and they're looking for more food. And this is where the next lesson kicks in. So here we are in John 6, verse 26, the people have come looking for food. And Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man," so he's talking about himself there, "which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him, God the Father has set his seal." That's a key detail, isn't it? Keep that last phrase there that we've highlighted in your mind for a moment. This is evidence that John provides that shows us that Jesus is not God. In fact, in this chapter, John provides broadly 5 strands of evidence to show this. Remember, we're looking at what the friends of Jesus understood about him. So what does John tell us about his friend? Well, these are the points that we can take. First of all, that God and the Father, those titles, those details, those names are equivalent phrases, and God gives authority to Jesus. We find that Jesus was sent by God. John 6 also tells us that Jesus did not come to do his own will, but to perform the will of God. But there's more. It shows that God gave the disciples to Jesus. They were a gift to him. And also Peter, One of those disciples describes Jesus as the Holy One of God. Okay, so let's look at that first strand of evidence. Jesus speaks a lot about his Father in this chapter, so we need to be sure of who that is. The American Standard Bible shows that God is the Father. It says there, "For him, the Father, even God, hath sealed." The word God and this phrase, the Father, are exactly equivalent here. They're equal, aren't they? And look at what God does. He sets his seal on Jesus. It's a funny phrase, isn't it? What does that mean? What does it mean? He sets his seal on Jesus. Well, it's a granting of authority. It's like a wax seal that can be used to seal a letter. Or perhaps, I suppose, a better picture really is it's a handing over of the signet ring. Okay, that which is used to make the impression on the wax. Jesus has been given the authority to work and speak on God's behalf. Now, this handing over or this sharing of authority, it would not be necessary if Jesus was God. Let's move on to our next piece of evidence, seeing that Jesus was sent by God. So John shows many times that Jesus was sent by God, and 5 of those instances are here in chapter 6. Why is this evidence that Jesus is not God? Well, to put it really simply, to put it plainly, if Jesus is sent by God, he cannot be God. You can send an email, you can send a letter, you can send a person even to do something for you. But to send yourself? Well, I had a good think about this to see how it could be done. And the closest I've come to sending myself anywhere was by sending a blood sample in the mail. That's a real stretch, isn't it? I wouldn't say that I have sent myself. Well, if we jump ahead to chapter 13 of John, we find Jesus speaking about those who are sent. He gives us some really clear details. So, truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. So we find that because he was sent by God, Jesus was not equal to God, as he's told us that someone is always sent by someone greater. Oh, hang on, the verse said, a servant is not greater than his master. In John chapter 5, Jesus was accused of making himself equal with God because he stated that God is his Father. If you've not already seen it, then please see the earlier video in this series that looks at that chapter to see what that is all about. And he goes on in chapter 13 to say, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. If God and Jesus were the same, then this could be seen as a cyclical or a redundant statement. It just goes in circles. If God sent Jesus, then equally that means that Jesus sent God. So whichever is received, both are received because they are the same. Confused yet? Yeah, I am. I think it's more like this. On the other hand, when we see that God is the Father who has sent his Son, he sent his Son Jesus with a message to share, then the picture, it resolves itself, because Jesus passes that gospel message along to his disciples and he sends them to share it with the people. If the people receive the message gladly, then the disciples, Jesus and God, they are all received because the message is the same. The message that they are sharing is the same. Now, as I said, there are loads of verses throughout the gospel, and they consistently show this picture of God sending his Son, and Jesus in turn sending his disciples to share the gospel message. Now, remember, we've seen that God and the Father are the same. Those phrases are equivalent. So if the Father sent Jesus, then that means it was God who sent him. And stepping through John's Gospel, we see 5 occasions where the individual who sends Jesus is explicitly described as God. I'll just jump through these slides. Again, pause the video if you want to read them in detail. So we have John 3:17. He says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world." And John 3:34, he says, "God has sent." John 8:42, Jesus said, "I came not of my own accord, but he," speaking of God, "sent me." And John 17:3, "The only true God and Jesus Christ whom you have sent." There's a distinction made there. If you read more verses around that, you see the distinction. And then John 6:28. And look, we're back at our chapter. This is the chapter that we're focusing on. So I'm going to read this as it will lead us onto our next strand of evidence. So remember, the people had come looking for more food, and they find Jesus teaching. And they actually find him teaching in a synagogue in Capernaum, which is near the Sea of Galilee. Let's pick up where we left off. I'm going to read from verse 26. Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes." So he's talking about something that's temporary. Don't work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal. And then the words on the screen here, verse 28. Then they said to him, "What must we do to be doing the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said to him, "Then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." So the crowd, they're referring back to the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. In other words, they said, when our forebears were in the wilderness, when they'd left Egypt, they were provided with heavenly food by Moses. So we know that he was sent by God. What can you bring to the table? What can you offer? Well, Jesus corrected them that it was God who provided the food in the wilderness, not Moses. And he then answered their question with this really bold statement. He said, "I am the bread of life." That's what he offers. He brings himself to the table. He was saying that he gives himself as something more permanent. His life being offered would be a more lasting, once for all offering that could bring everlasting life to those that believe. Now, sadly, the crowd couldn't grasp what Jesus was saying, that he was speaking in a spiritual rather than a physical sense. And this led to many of those who had followed him up to this point leaving his company. As I said, this takes us to the next strand of evidence that John uses to demonstrate that Jesus is not God. And what is that? Well, John 6 tells us that Jesus did not come to do his own will, but perform the will of God. And here are the verses that show that. This links with our previous piece of evidence because it tells us again that Jesus was sent by God, and also that he's come to do the will of God rather than his own. So there's 2 points there, that Jesus was sent by God and also that he's come to do the will of God rather than his own. So in both points, he is subordinate to God. He is serving God, and he's not made himself equal with God. And have a look at this. I've just changed it. It's the same verse, but see, I've just adjusted the highlight. As an aside now, verse 38 says, "For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will." Now that can be confusing for people, but we must read this in the context of the conversation that's going on. It's a really important key to Bible study. Read it in the context of the conversation that's happening. And remember, we've already seen that Jesus uses a lot of symbolic language, a lot of pictures to explain difficult concepts. So do we take this verse literally, or do we recognize it as a picture? Remember, they're talking about manna in the wilderness. Jesus is likening himself to the manna that was sent from heaven, albeit as something even better. He's saying that he has been sent with a heavenly purpose. He has not physically come down from heaven. And this is actually, in part, why the crowds had a problem. Have a look at these verses. The people, they misunderstood who the father of Jesus truly was. They thought it was Joseph, but they'd seen Jesus brought up from a child. So they were correct that Jesus had not physically come down from heaven, but they also didn't grasp that he had been sent in a more spiritual sense. To put a very mundane, modern spin on this, a way that helps me to picture this, to view it, is that it's a bit like ordering a gift online. I have a friend, Sam, who lives in Canada. I'm in the UK, he's in Canada. So if I send him a gift, I might go onto a Canadian website and buy him a t-shirt or a big box of crisps, or one time a tangerine coloured pottery dolphin. And when making the order, I request that this gift is sent from the depot in Canada to Sam's house, which is in Canada. There's no sense getting it sent to me just to be sent back again. So it gets sent direct to him. I never physically come into contact with the gift that I'm sending. Nevertheless, if Sam's wife were to ask him, "Oh, hey, where has this gift come from?" Well, the answer Sam gives is, "Oh, it's come from John in the UK." Now, perhaps that's not a great example, but it helps me see how it's possible for Jesus to have come from heaven in a spiritual way rather than a physical, literal sense. So we've seen that he came to do the will of God. Verse 39 tells us more of what that will of God is, or what God wanted Jesus to do. And it also gives us our fourth strand of evidence. And it's just a small piece of evidence, but it's still crucial. And it's found when Jesus says that he's been given something by his Father, who is God. Well, there are the verses. But whom or what had Jesus been given? He says, "I should lose nothing of all that he has given me." Well, the slide title has given it away, hasn't it? Let's have a look ahead to John 17. If we go to John 17, in this prayer, Jesus talks about how he has been given the disciples, how he's been given his followers. And we know this because he mentions that all of them have been kept safe, except for the son of destruction, or son of perdition. And we take that to mean Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. And later on, in the later verses there, we see in this chapter, in chapter 17, how Jesus acknowledges that he has passed on from God the message to those he was given, primarily to the disciples. So we see that God gave his son the disciples. And this shows us again how Jesus is not God. They are distinct from one another. Let's see our final strand of evidence. Peter describing that Jesus is the Holy One of God. So remember the situation. Here at the end of the chapter, as the crowds leave, they've not been able to accept what they've been told because they took the words of Jesus too literally. And so they're leaving, the crowds are departing. And imagine how crestfallen Jesus must have felt. And he turns to his disciples, those 12, and he asks, "Do you want to go away as well?" And we see that Jesus is described by Peter as the Holy One of God. What a boost that must have been to hear from his friends, showing their belief and their understanding. And what insight Peter has. He doesn't say, "You are the Holy God." No, he says, "You are the Holy One of God." Or if we recall the prayer that that he makes in chapter 17, Peter is saying, you are the Holy One sent by God to us. From this, we can see that God has made Jesus holy, separate from other men and women. It means that Jesus is not God, but it does mean that he is God's son, which is in its own right a very beautiful fact. So we've looked at the strands of evidence in John 6, and we've found that they fit with the wider view of the Bible. We've seen what those who stood face to face with Jesus said about him and their understanding of him as an individual. And this is beneficial for us because understanding the relationship between God and Jesus is vital to unlocking our understanding of further Bible knowledge. It's a common principle, isn't it, that God reveals himself through other beings who are not themselves God. Now, to finish with an easy to grasp picture, let's frame it this way. Before he was born, Mary was told that her son, Jesus, that her son would be given, amongst other names, the name Emmanuel, meaning God with us. When Jesus says, those who have seen me have seen the Father, well, it's like an actor taking on a part. The actor does their best to mimic and to show the qualities of the person they are representing, especially so when it's based on real individuals. The actor is trying to be that person. And when the credits roll, well, the credits show the character's name first and then the actor's name. So if the actor does a great job at manifesting that person, then you, the viewer, become immersed in watching the character and not the actor. And so Jesus, who has lived out the word and the commands of God far closer than any of us, showed the people around him, and he shows us today, his Father, the Almighty God. Just some final thoughts. By showing that Jesus is not God, by making him a human with free will and a sinful nature, could we be accused of somehow dragging the Son of God down, taking him down from a loftier position? Well, I would reason that it's the opposite. These facts, this makes the sacrifice that was made much more powerful. In the letter of James, in chapter 1, we're told that God cannot be tempted with evil. If Jesus is God, and therefore cannot even be tempted to sin, to err from the right way, then from my understanding, that makes the sacrifice empty. And we're told in Hebrews that Jesus was tempted, but that he did not actually commit a sin. He was perfectly obedient to his Father. He says in Hebrews 4, verse 14, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So when we find that Jesus is a man, a human like you and I, who was tempted to sin, and yet he submitted himself to death, that he made himself a willing sacrifice, well, the fact that a man with a sinful nature is not given into the impulses of that nature, well, it's far more powerful. It resonates with us because it's a sacrifice made on our behalf for all the people that haven't been as obedient. It gives us hope. Just consider how much more powerful this is, that Jesus, a man, overcame the sin of the world. And that is so exciting because it was all done because God is more than willing to have a relationship with us. But that is another video for another time. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful. If you found this video beneficial, then please click the thumbs up, share and subscribe if you want to see more in this series, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.